All right, so a couple of days ago in East Palestine, which is not the Palestine we're used to talking about on this channel, this one is actually in Ohio, there was a train derailment that took place, which has led to absolutely catastrophic consequences for the people living in this community. And I wanted to show you guys just this tweet thread breakdown from More Perfect Union as an introduction, showing us what it actually looked like on the ground. You see this massive fireball that has been emerging. Essentially, you had a train that was derailed. It was carrying toxic chemicals on it, which were misclassified because of a lobbying blitz from a lot of these billion-dollar train companies. And you have this toxic spill that takes place. It gets lit on fire, and you have this toxic chemicals that are spewing into the atmosphere and causing a bunch of tangential consequences as the outgrowth of that. And then after we go through this thread, I want to show you guys this great piece that was put together by The Lever. We have David Sirota, Julia Rock, Rebecca Burns, and Matthew Cunningham Cook all working together on this piece, which is going to tie this current train derailment into the broader conversations in terms of corruption in our politics by a lot of these wealthy corporations and how that led to this inevitable consequence, which, just as a reminder, when the Biden administration was sabotaging the ability for a lot of these rail workers to go on strike just a couple months ago that I talked about extensively on this channel, one of the main demands from those workers was, number one, they wanted things like paid sick leave and a whole bunch of other benefits as well, which were basically just the bare minimum that they obviously deserved. But then on top of that, if you actually listen to the testimony back during that time and during that whole debate, one of the main things that they were asking for was increased safety standards, because they knew that something like this was inevitably going to happen again. And it looks like those rail workers were 100% vindicated and correct on that prediction. So here from More Perfect Union, they start off saying, on February 3rd, a horrifying railroad accident took place. A Norfolk Southern freight train derailed in East Palestine, Ohio. You might have seen images of the flames, but you probably haven't heard that the unions were trying to prevent this exact accident. Okay, so here's what it actually looked like on the ground. I mean, Jesus fucking Christ, you can see it sort of just getting ignited there. And part of this is they're saying, like, okay, we wanted to, somewhat have this be ignited, in an immediate sense to try to, prevent a lot of the after effects of some of these toxic chemicals. But either way, I mean, imagine living in this community here and you're seeing just a gigantic fireball exploding in the center of your community because of just complete negligence from a lot of these billion-dollar corporations who are shoveling off, tens of billions of dollars on an annual basis to Wall Street ghouls instead of making investments and increasing safety standards so that this wouldn't happen in the first place. But again, thousands and thousands of people have been forced to evacuate from this community. So they continue saying that union rail workers with railroad workers have warned of a ticking time bomb, saying in the last 10 years, Class 1 carriers have dramatically increased both the length and tonnage of the average train while cutting back maintenance and inspection. And remember, last fall, when rail workers were about to strike, they repeatedly expressed that the rail company's system of running their lines, which they called precision scheduling railroading, was really about profit maximization at the expense of worker and public safety. And even more fundamental to the union argument was and is that railroads are trying to run these complex operations with fewer and fewer workers. Remember, we talked about that on this channel, where you have, like, literally in some circumstances a single worker who is operating this train, and they're carrying, potentially even like over a mile long of freight, and they're having to do this all by themselves with little to no breaks on, long journeys that can average between like 10 to 15 hours in some circumstances. So it's just completely unreasonable, dangerous circumstances that these workers are facing on behalf of these companies making slight marginal cuts to their costs, in this case on labor costs and on costs in terms of investing in safety equipment and all of that, and upgrades to our railroad infrastructure, and choosing to send that money to Wall Street ghouls instead. So now I want to get to this piece here, which basically breaks this down in its full. So here from The Lever, they say rail companies blocked safety rules before Ohio derailment. So what are they talking about here? They say, before this weekend's fiery Norfolk Southern train derailment prompted emergency evacuations in Ohio, the company helped kill a federal safety rule aimed at upgrading the rail industry's Civil War era braking systems, according to documents reviewed by The Lever. We still have not upgraded since the Civil War. That's what we're talking about here. And keep in mind, it's not as if these companies are cash strapped, okay? They're just spending their money on rewarding Wall Street shareholders instead of actually investing in upgrading the infrastructure. So they say, though the company's 150-car train in Ohio reportedly burst into 100-foot flames upon derailing and was transporting materials that triggered a fireball when they were released and incinerated, it was not being regulated as a high-hazard flammable train, federal officials told The Lever. Think about that for a second, okay? This is part of the deregulation. A large portion of this happened under the Trump administration, but even, the Obama administrations and before that, you had a lack of regulation surrounding these types of safety standards, to the point where after the Trump administration decided to gut these regulations even further, you have a situation where a train car that is carrying obviously dangerous chemicals on it that would lead to these type of consequences if there was to be some sort of an accident, and this train was not even classified under this label of having a high hazard flammability to it. Okay, so again, this is what happens when you gut these government agencies and prevent them from doing the job of actually protecting, number one, the environment, and also public safety within the United States. So they say documents show that when current transportation safety rules were first created, a federal agency sided with industry lobbyists and limited regulations governing the transport of hazardous compounds. And the decision effectively exempted many trains hauling dangerous materials, including the one in Ohio, from the high hazard classification and its more stringent safety requirements. And amid the lobbying blitz against stronger transportation safety regulations, Norfolk Southern paid executives millions and spent billions on stock buybacks, which, by the way, should be completely fucking illegal for any company to be engaging in. Stock buybacks are literally just when a gigantic corporation chooses to buy back some of their stock in order to restrict the supply and artificially inflate their stock price so that gives higher payouts to shareholders. Okay, so that's what stock buybacks are. They should just be illegal. Okay, this is just stock manipulation. It shouldn't even be allowed, point blank, period. But again, this doesn't just go for the rail lines. This goes for basically every major company in the United States right now, where instead of actually investing in upgrading their products and upgrading their services and upgrading their infrastructure or safety or investing in their workers, they are just choosing to inflate their stock prices. And that is exactly what has been happening with companies like Norfolk Southern. And they say this was happening all while the company shed thousands of employees despite warnings that understaffing is intensifying safety risks. And Norfolk Southern officials also fought off a shareholder initiative that could have required company executives to assess, review, and mitigate risks of hazardous material transportation. So they're even pushing back against some of the things that the stockholders actually wanted here. They say the sequence of events began a decade ago in the wake of a major uptick in derailments of trains carrying crude oil and hazardous chemicals, including a New Jersey train crash that leaked the same toxic chemical as in Ohio. And in response, so a little bit of credit here to the Obama administration, they say that in 2014, they proposed improving safety regulations for trains carrying petroleum and other hazardous materials. However, after industry pressure, the final measure ended up narrowly focused on the transport of crude oil and exempting trains carrying many other combustible materials, including the chemical involved in this weekend's disaster. Okay, so classic Obama fashion here, a neoliberal ghoul through and through. Okay, maybe we'll start to patch on some band-aids that could possibly have some sort of an impact on some specific situations with crude oil and accidents surrounding that, but we're not really going to confront the power and the influence of these gigantic railroad monopolistic corporations. We are just going to apply the most mild of regulations that you could possibly imagine and hope that something like this doesn't happen in the future, which obviously they were wrong about. Then we get to the Trump administration, who made the situation even worse. So they say in 2017, after rail industry donors delivered more than $6 million to GOP campaign, the Trump administration, backed by rail lobbyists and Senate Republicans, rescinded part of that rule aimed at making better braking systems widespread on the nation's rails. Specifically, regulators killed provisions requiring rail cars carrying hazardous flammable materials to be equipped with electronic braking systems to stop trains more quickly than conventional air brakes. Norfolk Southern had previously touted the new technology, known as electronically controlled pneumatic brakes, or ECP brakes, for its, quote, potential to reduce train stopping distances by as much as 60% over conventional air brake systems. Keep in mind, these are the same systems that have been roughly in place since the fucking Civil War. Okay, that's what we're talking about. And on top of that, you see here that even the company in question here that was responsible for this train derailment, they've even admitted previously that this electronic braking system is superior and could possibly prevent some of the more catastrophic consequences from accidents like the one that we just saw in Ohio. But of course, they ended up pushing back against this because that would actually require them to spend some money instead of shoveling it off to Wall Street in their actual product and upgrading their infrastructure and safety standards. And I mean, the basics of this are very simple. If you have electronically controlled braking systems, obviously electrons, they travel at the speed of light, and because of that, you are able to stop every single individual car that is a part of this train at the same time, instead of an air brake system, which has to travel one by one by one by one, leading to basically this crumple effect within the entirety of, again, what can sometimes be over a mile-long trains, and is much, obviously less efficient in terms of stopping the entire process. So the electronic brakes were obviously superior. Even the company in question had admitted that. Everybody knew that, but instead they decided to basically give into corporate pressure and rescind some of these regulations. So they then say that the company's lobbying group nonetheless pressured for the rule's repeal, telling regulators that it would impose tremendous costs without providing offsetting safety benefits. Of course they would fucking say that. They don't want to spend a single goddamn penny on upgrading their safety standards, if that means that they can ship more off to their shareholders. But they say that that argument won out with Trump officials, because of course it did, and the Biden administration has also not moved to reinstate the brake rule or expand the kinds of trains subjected to tougher safety regulations. So the Biden administration, this could go for many different topics that we cover on this channel, is essentially following in the footsteps of the Trump administration in terms of refusing to confront a lot of these corporations who are, not willing or not able to, move forward with some of these basic upgrades to their safety measures. But they got a quote here saying, "Would ECP brakes have reduced the severity of this accident?" Yes, says Stephen Dittmeyer, a former senior official at the Federal Railroad Administration. And he says the railroads will test new features, but once they are told that they have to do it, they don't want to spend the money. Of course, they say a spokesperson for one advocacy group pressing for tougher safety regulations said that the Ohio disaster is the latest consequence of the rail industry's cost-cutting, profit-at-all-cost business model, which just kind of makes me think, like, why the fuck is this even a privatized industry in the first place? Why is this not a nationalized industry? I mean, we saw these conversations happening during the Biden administration as they were crushing these workers' ability to actually go on strike to make some demands, including these upgraded safety regulations. Why is this not something that is just fully nationalized? I mean, what is the benefit of having this owned by for-profit billion-dollar corporations who are essentially spending the bulk of their money just to enrich their shareholders? What benefit do we have on that? I mean, if you go back to some of the arguments during the standoff on the potential for that strike that was potentially going to be taking place, everybody was saying, oh my God, this is a national security risk, right? This is a national security issue. This could tank the entire American economy. And it's like, okay, if the stakes are that high, maybe you shouldn't put this entire process in the hands of companies whose sole purpose is to extract profits out of this entire process and potentially jeopardizing our rail network transportation system and our economy, therefore, with accidents like this. Why are you allowing them to do this? This shouldn't be an industry that is in the hands of for-profit corporations. But they continue saying that prior to the stock buyback era, railroads agreed that ECP brakes were a good thing, said Ron Kamenikow, a longtime railroad worker and organizer with the Railroad Workers United, and he says the railroad hasn't yet come to the realization that they could do whatever they wanted. So this was before, and they say ECP brakes were on the drawing board and then off again once they realized they were actually going to have to spend some money on that. Now I'm going to switch down here, moving away from some of the braking issues, because again, it's not just about the fact that they have refused to implement some of these electronic braking systems because that would cost them this money that they would instead rather ship off to Wall Street ghouls. But in addition to that, we also have the problem with some of these trains that are in fact carrying hazardous materials not even being labeled under this HHFT, the highly flammable characteristics, right? And under these guidelines that are in place right now, these high hazard flammable trains as they are called. So now we get to a different form of regulation where there has also been issues. So they say alongside their their campaign to kill the brake rule, industry lobbyists pushed to limit the types of chemical compounds that would be covered by regulations, including the brake rule. They proposed limiting the definition of high-hazard flammable trains, or HHFTs, mostly to cover oil trains, but not trains carrying the industrial chemical on the Norfolk Southern train that necessitated evacuations in Ohio, which again makes absolutely no fucking goddamn sense, because if you look into what these actual chemical compounds are and how dangerous they are, I mean, these are chemicals where, you know, some of them have like a boiling point of 8 degrees Fahrenheit, and they're extremely delicate, and if there ever is a crash like this, they obviously are going to be highly flammable, but somehow that, you know, evades the regulations surrounding how we're going to classify these trains. I mean, it's just brazenly corrupt. But they say, by contrast, the National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB, the federal agency tasked with investigating transportation accidents, argued for a broader definition of high-hazard flammable trains, which seems like exactly what we should be doing here. But now I just want to switch down to the end of this article where they basically sum this entire situation up and what needs to be done. Okay, so they say, according to federal investigators, the derailment was caused by a mechanical issue with the rail car axle. Dittmeyer and 2 other experts told the lever that ECP braking probably would have reduced the damage caused by the derailment by bringing the train to a halt more quickly and stopping all of the cars simultaneously. And they say if the axle breaks, it's almost certain that the train is going to derail, said John Risch, the former BNSF engineer and national legislative director for Sheet Metal, Air, Rail, and Transportation Union. And he says ECP brakes would help to bring the train to a stop. What they do is activate the brakes on each car at the same time immediately, and that's significant, obviously, when you want to actually stop a train instead of having to do it car by car by car by car using these conventional air braking systems. And they say instead of investing their money in this safety feature, the 7 largest freight railroad companies in the United States, including Norfolk Southern, spent $191 billion. $191 billion on stock buybacks and shareholder dividends between 2011 and 2021. Almost $200 billion over the last decade or so has been dumped into Wall Street, which produces absolutely fucking nothing for the broader implications of our economy, for the broader implications of our transportation system, and, for the American people's safety in situations like that. Just down the drain, almost $200 billion over the course of a decade. These companies are just leeches. That is all that they are doing, and they are jeopardizing, again, our economy and our public safety in the process of trying to enrich themselves. So they say this is far more than $138 billion that they spent on capital investments during the same period. I mean, it's just completely insane that they would even be allowed to spend this money on stock buybacks at all, let alone spending it more than they are on actual investments in upgrading the service that they are providing. But they say the same companies also slashed their workforces by nearly 30% in that time frame as a part of what they called precision scheduled railroading, and such staffing cuts are likely contributing to safety issues in the freight railways. And in a recent investor presentation, Norfolk Southern disclosed an increase in train accidents over the past 3 consecutive years. Yeah, no fucking shit. You have 1 or 2 guys who are having to work these mile-long trains carrying hazardous materials for 14 hours at a time. Oh my god, I'm so shocked and surprised that we're having an increase in accidents because you have been cutting back on your safety standards and the amount of workers who actually know what the fuck they're doing. I mean, again, these people are just sitting in, their ivory towers on Wall Street making these decisions. Oh, this will help us save this amount of money so we can deliver that to our shareholders, just completely ignoring what the actual workers on the ground are telling them are the real legitimate risks involved with this type of an industry. But they got a quote here saying that the massive reduction in the workforce, attendance policies that encourage people to come to work even when they're sick or exhausted, as well as a lack of access to paid leave, the stress that is constantly put on the workers because of how lean the workforce has become, it creates a negative culture in terms of safety. And they say last fall, of course, again, President Joe Biden and Congress helped the industry crush an effort by rail workers to win paid sick leave by intervening to block a rail strike. Okay, the most pro-union president in modern American history, as Joe Brandon likes to call himself here, okay, absolute fucking nonsense. They say as the industry has resisted safety measures and shed staff, rail companies have increased the length of trains. Norfolk Southern was the leader in this category in 2021 with an average train length of over 7,000 feet, which is is 1.3 miles or 100 rail cars, and the Norfolk Southern train that derailed in Ohio was 9,300 feet long, or nearly almost 2 miles long. They say, quote, "Our push for efficiency led to record train weight and record train length in the quarter." So they're bragging about this on their earnings call, okay? They're bragging about the strategies they have put in place, these cost-cutting measures, these efficiency measures, which are brutalizing the workers and leading to an increased likelihood of these types of catastrophic consequences. But they finish off here saying, "Concerns about train length and public safety prompted federal funding for a study on the issue in the 2021 infrastructure bill, and on Tuesday, residents of East Palestine filed suit against Norfolk Southern in a U.S. district court alleging negligence." And honestly, I genuinely do hope that they win that suit, but again, this has much broader implications for the American economy, for the American people. Again, I think this industry should just be fully nationalized at the end of the day. I see absolutely no benefit whatsoever to having this be a profit-driven industry. You can see the evidence right here in front of your face, what they are actually spending their money on. They're not adequately upgrading their infrastructure. They are not adequately upgrading their safety standards. They are treating their workers like cogs in a machine and absolutely brutalizing them and leaving them in situations, as we heard from their testimonies when they were about to go on strike before Joe Brandon decided to step in and crush them, about how they are barely able to maintain any sort of social life or family life. Okay, this is a completely absurd, ridiculous situation that we have right now. Nationalize the entire fucking industry, okay? That's my take on this matter. It's not even just about regulations that you could put in place, which you absolutely should, if that's the sort of half-assed, half-measured approach that a lot of Democrats may want to go in the direction in terms of handling this industry. Sure, you could add some safety regulations and, clamp down on a lot of these companies and what they're able to spend their money on. Of course, ban stock buybacks and all of that, but this is just one of those industries similar to healthcare, similar to pharmaceuticals, in my opinion, that just makes absolutely no sense to not have it fully nationalized if it is really the national security issue that a lot of politicians say that it is, which I honestly agree with to an extent. Now, I'm going to finish off here because on top of this entire ridiculous situation, we also had a journalist for News Nation who was trying to cover this incident, okay? And this might be some of the reason why this has not been covered in mainstream news as much, but you had one guy who was trying to show up to a press conference with the governor, Mark DeWine, and he was just arrested for setting up his equipment there and trying to cover this press conference. I mean, it's like, what are we even doing in this country anymore, okay? You have, corporations who are able to effectively, legally bribe and corrupt our government officials to the point where they gut safety regulations, they gut safety standards, okay? They allow these companies to spend tens of billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars on stock buybacks over the course of decades. And then when it comes to actually trying to hold them accountable, oh, we're just going to turn around and have the cops, who are, of course, the jackbooted thugs for the capitalist class, turn around and arrest the journalists who are trying to do their job and cover this entire story. So, I mean, listen, again, you guys have my takeaway from this. I think that this is an industry, doesn't belong in the hands of Wall Street ghouls or private individuals or corporations. This is something that should be fully nationalized. Obviously, there's a lot of conversations we could be having about the failures of the Joe Biden administration, the guy who wants to pretend like he is the most pro-union president in the history of the world, and he turns around, crushes this strike that was potentially incoming from these unions, and of course neglects a lot of the safety demands that they were trying to make as a part of that fight.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying